Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the dim and echoing silence of a medieval graveyard, not the bright and polished kind you might imagine with neat marble headstones, but something much rougher, half forgot, where the grass grows wild and the earth holds secrets. You picture yourself walking slowly along uneven ground, hearing the crunch of small stones underfoot, the air damp and heavy with that loamy smell of soil that's been turned too many times. Beneath your boots lies layer after layer of history, bones of farmers, monks, children, and somewhere deeper, the armored figures who once thundered across battlefields, the knights. Their stories aren't told in ballads tonight but whispered through scratches on their bones, worn enamel on their teeth, and iron buckles gone rusty. You probably won't survive this place in real life, it's damp, it's cold, and you'd likely trip into an open pit some archaeologist forgot to mark. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from, makes this feel like we're all walking the same crooked path through history together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move carefully toward one of the trenches, lit not by torches but by the buzzing glow of a generator lamp, and you watch as earth crumbles away to reveal the outline of something strange. Long bones pressed tight, shoulders hunched oddly, a jaw that seems too sharp. Archaeologists lean in, brushes in hand, and you crouch beside them, peering into the centuries. It's a knight, though you wouldn't guess it at first glance. His armor's gone, rusted away, but the body itself speaks. You can see grooves on his shoulder bones where straps once dug in, the constant weight of chain mail dragging down across years. It's a reminder that knights didn't just parade around looking noble, they carried metal cages on their backs so heavy they left permanent scars. One mainstream historical fact flows here. Researchers at burial sites in England and France have confirmed that many skeletons of knights show spinal compression, early arthritis, and even broken ribs that had healed badly, proving their lives were far more brutal than romantic stories suggested. You lean closer and almost feel the ache in your own back. Imagine never knowing a day without that weight. But then there's something quirky, a detail you wouldn't expect. In one grave, archaeologists found a knight buried with what looked like chicken bones tucked near his waist. At first they thought it was some kind of animal intrusion, but closer analysis showed the bones had been deliberately placed, almost like a snack packed for the afterlife. Was this superstition a final meal? Historians still argue whether this was a symbolic gesture, a family quirk, or just somebody dropping their lunch into the grave by mistake. And then deeper down, stranger still. Some knights' teeth show faint blue lines when examined under a microscope, traces of lapis lazuli pigment. This suggests these men weren't just fighters. Some may have doubled as artists or scribes, handling precious paints and manuscripts. Imagine after wielding a sword, one of them sitting by candlelight, tongue touching a brush, helping create a glowing miniature of saints. It's almost absurd, a warrior with ink-stained teeth, yet the bones don't lie. You pause as another skeleton is brushed clean. His skull carries a slice so sharp and clean you can practically see the blade falling in your mind's eye. But here, the unsettling part, the cut didn't kill him. The bone regrew, fusing around the wound, meaning he lived on, scarred but still swinging his weapon. This one fact alone changes your mental picture. Knights weren't invincible, they were patched-up survivors. Imagine limping back to the castle after battle, armor dented, bones aching, but still expected to mount up again. As the archaeologists whisper their findings, you drift in thought. What would it have felt like to lie down in one of these suits of armor, heavy, stiff, loud? And yet when the knight was stripped of it in death, buried under dirt, the only trace was the way the body had been shaped by years inside it. That's the mystery solved not by books but by bone. And here's a debate that lingers even as you lean in closer. Were knights mostly noble protectors, sworn to codes of chivalry, or were they mercenaries in shining shells, more thug than saint? Historians still argue whether the evidence we see in their skeletons, wounds, scars, injuries, shows them defending the weak or simply fighting for whoever paid best. The graves won't answer, but you can almost hear the echo of hoofbeats fade into silence as the soil closes back over their remains. The night deepens around you, the cool damp air clinging to your clothes, and the steady scrape of brushes on bone lulls you further into a rhythm. One grave at a time, mystery after mystery solved, the knights emerge not as legends but as tired, aching men. You keep walking the row, each burial like another page turned in a book you never knew existed, a story told in fragments of ribcage, in cracked helmets, in rusting belt buckles. It's not glamorous, not shining. It's human, raw, and oddly calming, as if knowing they suffered too makes history a little softer around the edges. You shuffle onward, past the trenches where the bones of knights whisper their weary stories, and you enter another space, a dim stone hall that smells faintly of damp parchment and something sour-sweet, like herbs left too long in a jar. The monks who once lived here are gone, but their recipes, scribbled in margins and tucked between psalms, have been uncovered, decoded, and sometimes even cooked in modern kitchens. You pause by a wooden table scattered with fragments of vellum, each ink blot carrying a strange promise. This is not only about faith and prayer, but about what filled their bellies. One mainstream historical fact stands tall here. Medieval monasteries weren't just centers of religion, they were culinary laboratories. Monks wrote down instructions for brewing beer, for making cheese, for preserving fish in ways that kept communities alive through cold winters. And beer wasn't the frothy, golden drink you imagine. It was often cloudy, thick, and nutritious enough to count as food. You sip it in your imagination, lukewarm and grainy, and you almost gag, though monks swore by it. But then comes the quirky discovery. Archaeologists and food historians recently found a recipe that involved stuffing a roasted swan with eels, spices, and, believe it or not, tiny birds. A swan inside an eel, inside more birds, like some feathered medieval turducken gone terribly wrong. The notes suggested it was pleasing to noblemen. You can picture the monks smirking as they copied that down, maybe muttering under their breath about what counts as pleasing. Imagine serving that at your next dinner party. Your guests would probably not survive this one either. Still, some recipes surprise you with their humanity. A monk's scribble in one margin mentions honey cakes made with ground almonds and rose water. Sweet, fragrant, simple. You imagine a tired scribe sneaking into the kitchen, stealing a crumb, sticky fingers smearing ink across his parchment. Not everything was grim fasting or bizarre bird stuffing. Sometimes it was comfort food. And here lies a scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether monasteries truly followed their strict fasting rules, or if the clever recipes for almond cheese and mock meats were loopholes to let them feast without breaking vows. Were these monks holy men making do, or foodies bending the rules? The truth seems hidden in those greasy smudges on the margins, the way the parchment crinkles as if handled with oily fingers. You let yourself drift into the kitchen's heat, hear the crackle of firewood, smell the sharp bite of vinegar and spice. The clatter of knives and the muttered chants of monks mingle into something hypnotic. These recipes, once mysterious, now solved and tested, show a side of the Middle Ages that feels oddly modern. People always want to eat well, always find ways to turn the ordinary into something worth savoring. And as you imagine the flicker of torchlight on copper pots, you realize history isn't only armored bones and battles. Sometimes it's just a plate of food, awkwardly seasoned, handed to you by a monk who chuckles at your expression. You wander farther along the dim stone corridor, past kitchen fires now cold and archives now silent, until you find yourself standing inside the ruins of a castle. The walls rise jagged and broken against a silver sky, yet what draws your eye isn't the soaring towers or the arrow slits, it's the squat, protruding box-like structures that cling to the sides of the fortress like little stone birdhouses. You blink, tilt your head, and realize, yes, these are the medieval toilets, the guardrobes, those humble but essential spaces where even the most glittering royalty had to take care of business. One solid historical fact emerges quickly. Castles were full of them, sometimes one in nearly every chamber, and they weren't glamorous at all. Picture a small wooden seat with a hole cut through it, perched high over the outer wall of the castle. Waste fell straight down the chute, often into a moat or a cesspit where it mingled with rainwater, mud, and the unfortunate rats. The romantic notion of knights and ladies tends to skip this part, but bones of truth are hard to hide. When archaeologists examined the soil under these chutes, they found layers of seeds, parasites, and even pollen grains that told exactly what people ate and how poorly they digested it. But here, the quirky tidbit that makes you stifle a laugh. In some castles, guardrobes doubled as secret hiding spots for valuables, because who would go digging around there? Excavations have turned up lost rings, coins, even a forgotten jeweled dagger wedged deep in the muck of a centuries-old toilet shaft. You imagine some unlucky noble leaning too far forward one night, hearing a plop that wasn't supposed to happen, and realizing his gold trinket had joined the sewage river. And here comes the debate that still rumbles. Historians argue whether these guardrobes were designed with hygiene in mind, or whether they were simply the most convenient architectural afterthoughts. Some say castle builders carefully aligned waste chutes so running water would flush them. Others argue it was pure chance, a happy accident of rain and gravity. You lean out the stone opening, cold wind brushing your face, and picture some medieval engineer scratching his head, muttering about angles and flow while the noble inside just grumbles, "Hurry up, I'm freezing." The sensory details stick with you. The echo of dripping water down a narrow chute, the rank smell clinging to damp stone, the creak of a wooden seat under armored weight. You smirk at the thought of a fully dressed knight trying to balance sword, chain mail, and dignity in a chamber barely big enough to turn around in. The garderobe wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And as you step away, back into the ruined corridor, you notice how history hums with these solved mysteries: bones in graves, recipes in parchment, toilets in castle walls. Even the most powerful figures of the Middle Ages couldn't escape the same needs you have every day. And maybe that, in its own odd way, is comforting. You drift onward, leaving behind the dripping chutes and chilly guardrobes until the night carries you into another shadowed corner of medieval life, this one cloaked in long-nosed masks and the smell of pungent herbs. The image is already burned into your brain: the plague doctor with his beaked mask, wide-brimmed hat, and long cloak. You've seen the costumes at Halloween parties, the memes, the unsettling paintings. But tonight you lean closer, past the spooky reputation, and into the soil and scraps that scientists have only just begun to interpret. The hard historical fact first. During outbreaks of the Black Death, especially in the 14th century, doctors did wear protective gear, though not always as dramatic as the masks we picture. The beak mask became common in parts of Europe by the 17th century, stuffed with dried flowers, vinegar-soaked sponges, or herbs like rosemary and thyme. The idea wasn't wrong in principle. They thought bad smells or miasma carried disease, and those herbs created a barrier. When archaeologists recently examined a preserved mask, the lining still carried faint traces of dried lavender. You imagine that scent floating faintly, even centuries later, in a room otherwise filled with the sour reek of sickness. Now for the quirky discovery. In one excavation in Germany, fragments of a mask were found tucked beside a body, but the herbs inside weren't medicinal at all. Instead, it was stuffed with nutmeg and cinnamon, expensive spices that had no real healing power. Was the doctor a fraud, showing off luxury smells to reassure panicked patients, or was he just improvising with whatever he could get his hands on? You grin a little at the thought of someone treating the plague like a medieval bake-off. Ah yes, death and cinnamon, perfect pairing. And here the scholarly debate swells. Historians still argue whether those masks were widely used during the Black Death itself, or whether the image we hold today comes from later centuries, exaggerated and mythologized. Did terrified villagers really see these long-beaked figures stalking their streets in the 1340s, or is that a story grafted backward by time? Archaeologists point to the scattered evidence, doctors' journals, and the odd mask fragment, but the arguments continue, as foggy as the smoke of incense once burned in plague-stricken homes. You picture yourself walking through a medieval alley, the stones slick underfoot, the air heavy with wood smoke, and suddenly there, one of those figures turning the corner. The beak points toward you, and though you know it's just leather and herbs, your heart thumps anyway. The mask was never meant to scare, but it became the perfect image of dread. And yet step back into the dig site, and what you see isn't a nightmare but a solved puzzle. Fibers, herbs, bone dust in the soil, all telling you that even in the darkest times people tried. They stuffed beaks with lavender, waved rosemary branches, and hoped. And hope, you realize, is as much a part of the bones of history as any sword or crown. You step away from the silent figure of the plague doctor and into a colder, windier space. The air tastes of salt now, damp and restless, and you hear the steady slap of waves against wooden hulls. The scene is no longer a cloister or a castle but a windswept Viking shipyard. Here, archaeologists kneel not over bones or parchment but over scraps of parchment maps, tiny fragments that once charted seas no medieval scribe was supposed to know so well. The mainstream historical fact anchors you. Viking sailors reached places centuries before Columbus. They traveled to Iceland, Greenland, and even touched North America around the year 1000. But the mystery had long been, did they have accurate maps or did they just wing it with stars and instinct? Recent studies of wormeat parchment marked with faint lines suggest the Vikings charted currents, coasts, and even distances with more precision than once believed. One fragment lines up eerily well with the North Atlantic's real geography. You imagine a sailor spreading the parchment by firelight, tracing a fingertip along the jagged coastline of a land he's never yet seen, trusting ink and hide to guide him. Then the quirky tidbit rises from the evidence. One Viking map fragment included what looked like doodles of sea monsters, drawn in the margins as warnings or maybe as jokes. A dragon-like figure curling near Iceland, a fish with a face oddly human. You grin at the thought, perhaps even Vikings got bored during map making and decided to scare whoever read it later. Beware, here be giant squid, also don't forget the salted fish. It's both frightening and funny, like doodles on your own notebook when the lesson goes on too long. And here comes the scholarly debate, still unsettled. Historians argue whether these maps were tools used widely among sailors, or whether they were rare ceremonial items, maybe even teaching aids for young navigators. Did every ship carry a chart, or did only a few men ever glimpse them? Some claim oral tradition and memory guided the voyages, with maps more symbolic than practical. Others insist the fragments prove a robust cartographic culture we've only just glimpsed. The truth, like a coastline in fog, remains blurred. The sensory details wash over you. Salt spray stinging your lips, the creak of oars in sockets, the smell of tar and pine resin smeared along a hull. You picture yourself gripping the edge of the ship as the cold sea rises and falls, the horizon endless. In your pocket is a scrap of hide, faint lines promising land beyond the water's gray expanse. It's a fragile hope, but it's enough. And when you lean closer to the excavation table, watching gloved hands turn those parchment pieces under lamplight, you realize the Vikings weren't reckless brutes charging blindly across oceans. They were observant, clever, and maybe even meticulous, men who turned ink and hide into maps that could outlast the storms. You leave behind the creaking timbers and salt-stung winds of the Viking shipyard and step into a dim chapel, its stone walls rough and cold beneath your fingertips. A faint light plays across the surface, not from stained glass, which is long shattered, but from thin carvings scratched into the walls centuries ago. At first, they look meaningless, crooked lines, circles, odd little figures. But as you lean in, the shapes sharpen into something more: medieval graffiti, messages from the past, the scribbles of peasants, pilgrims, and even bored guards who couldn't resist leaving their mark. The solid historical fact presents itself. Across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered layers of graffiti etched into churches, castles, and barns. Far from modern notions of vandalism, these carvings often carried deep meaning. Circles with spokes were protective symbols, believed to ward off witches or evil spirits. Ships carved into stone walls sometimes marked prayers for safe voyages. A name etched into the plaster of a chapel might be a humble pilgrim's way of saying, "I was here and I asked for a blessing." It's proof that even in sacred spaces, ordinary people left their voices behind. Then the quirky tidbit appears under your gaze. Among all the prayers and protective charms, archaeologists have found what are unmistakably doodles, medieval cartoons, if you will. A grinning knight with an oversized sword, a crude cow with too many legs, even what looks like a priest sketched with exaggerated ears. Someone, probably centuries ago, sat in church during a long sermon and decided to carve a joke into eternity. You smirk, realizing that human boredom is timeless. Picture a peasant thinking, "If I have to sit through another 2 hours of chanting, at least Father Thomas gets donkey ears." And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether graffiti like this was tolerated by church authorities or whether it was done in secret. Were these walls seen as communal canvases, places where every villager could add a symbol? Or were people sneaking their carvings under candlelight, hoping not to be caught? Some inscriptions are elaborate and carefully made, suggesting they were accepted, while others are scratched in corners as if hidden. The answer may never be clear. The sensory imagery draws you in further. Your fingers brush shallow grooves in the stone, the dust gritty under your nails. You hear the faint scrape of iron against plaster, a rhythm almost like breathing. Around you, the air smells of wax and ash, the chapel echoing with ghostly whispers of long-forgot prayers. And then for a moment you picture the room alive centuries ago, peasants kneeling, monks chanting, and one mischievous soul leaning forward, carving a tiny cow into the wall, snickering quietly. As you step back, the graffiti stretches like a tapestry of voices, protective charms, crude jokes, desperate prayers. And in the glow of the archaeologists' lamps, the mystery of those scratches is solved. They weren't vandalism. They were conversations with the divine, with fate, with boredom, with the world. A secret chorus of ordinary lives etched forever into stone. You leave the cool, dust-scratched chapel behind, stepping out into open ground where the earth has been churned by spades and brushes. Ahead, shallow pits glow under lamplight, each holding long bones still locked in the postures of battle. Here lies another kind of mystery that has only just been solved. Warriors who died wielding not the swords and spears of legend, but strange, unexpected weapons that baffled archaeologists when they first emerged from the soil. The hard historical fact first: excavations of medieval battlefields, places like Visby in Sweden or Toten in England, have revealed rows of skeletons showing wounds from swords, arrows, and polearms. These weren't noble duels, they were organized massacres. Yet in recent years, among the familiar injuries, researchers have identified marks left by unusual weapons, tools adapted for war that suggest knights and soldiers fought with whatever could be forged, borrowed, or improvised. One grave showed a deep, crushing wound that matched not a sword but a massive war hammer designed to crumple armor like a tin can. You imagine the sound of it, metal on metal, ringing across a field slick with mud. Now the quirky detail, the one that makes you tilt your head. In a burial pit in Eastern Europe, one skeleton was found clutching the rusted remains of what looked like a farmer's flail, the tool used to thresh grain. The bones bore matching injuries on others in the pit, meaning this humble barnyard implement had been turned into a lethal weapon. Picture it, a peasant yanked from his fields, swinging the same tool he'd used on wheat, now smashing into helmets. It's grim, but it's also strangely human, turning the familiar into survival. You almost chuckle, from grain to brains. though the joke sits uneasily in your throat. And here comes the scholarly debate that lingers even now. Historians still argue whether these odd weapons were common on battlefields or rare improvisations. Some suggest knights and soldiers deliberately carried unusual tools because they were effective against armor. Others believe they were last resorts, the desperate choice of under-equipped men forced into fights they never wanted. The graves don't tell motive, they only show bones crushed, ribs splintered, skulls cracked in ways that standard swords couldn't explain. The sensory details sharpen as you crouch by one of the skeletons. You see the notch in his shinbone shaped like the bite of an axe head. You hear the distant clang of iron, the groan of men bracing shields, the ragged breath of fighters sweating under steel. The ground smells of churned earth and iron rust, the taste metallic on your tongue. And in the flicker of torchlight, you imagine the chaos of that moment. Knights trained for war colliding with villagers wielding farm tools, the line between soldier and peasant blurring in the mud. As archaeologists brush dirt from these strange weapons, the mystery resolves itself into something clear but sobering. Medieval combat wasn't a neat chessboard of swords and banners. It was brutal improvisation. Anything heavy, sharp, or swinging could become a knight's final foe. And the skeletons, stiff in their awkward postures, seemed to whisper that no weapon was ever truly out of place when survival was on the line. You step carefully away from the battlefield graves, the air still thick with the imagined clang of iron and the groan of men under armor. The ground gives way to a quieter ruin now, an old library chamber, its walls damp, its wooden shelves collapsed into dust. At first glance it looks like nothing but mold and parchment scraps, but as you kneel closer you see faint markings on the pages, tiny slanted symbols that don't match the Latin letters you expect. You blink, lean closer, and realize you're staring at coded notes written by monks who lived centuries ago. The firm historical fact emerges. Monks in medieval monasteries weren't just copiers of holy texts. They often inserted their own notes, marginalia scribbled alongside psalms and sermons. Some were reminders, some were complaints about cold fingers or poor ink, and some were written in shorthand systems that scholars only recently cracked. These codes often hid practical information, like how many candles were left for winter or which brother kept sneaking extra rations. Imagine a monk hunched over his parchment, muttering about Brother Thomas's appetite while disguising it in symbols no outsider could read. Now the quirky discovery that makes you smile. Among these coded notes, researchers have found passages of gossip. In one manuscript from a German abbey, a cracked shorthand revealed complaints about a superior's bad singing voice. Another note mocked a bishop's fashion sense, saying his cloak shines like a goose's bottom. You nearly laugh aloud, realizing that even in solemn monasteries, sarcasm thrived. Picture the scribe chuckling to himself, quill tapping, then quickly disguising the joke with a flourish of coded marks. But the debate still lingers. Historians argue whether these coded notes were purely practical or whether they sometimes concealed forbidden knowledge, bits of heretical thought, dangerous alchemy recipes, or even personal secrets the monks couldn't admit openly. Some claim the codes were just shorthand for efficiency. Others whisper that hidden beneath layers of psalms are private worlds of doubt, longing, or scientific curiosity that the church might not have approved. The cracked symbols reveal fragments, but never the whole. The sensory atmosphere deepens as you trace the symbols with your fingertip. The parchment feels brittle, the ink flacking to powder. You hear the scratch of a quill echoing across a stone hall, the drip of rain seeping through a leaky roof, the shuffle of sandals on cold flagstones. The smell is sharp ink mixed with mold and candle smoke. And for a moment you can almost feel the monk's breath on your shoulder, hurried, nervous, as he glances over his back before marking down something not meant for eyes beyond his order. As archaeologists and linguists piece together these coded fragments, the mystery turns tangible. Monks were human, layered with humor, pettiness, secrets, and fears. Their shorthand wasn't just ink, it was a veil between them and the authority above, a way to whisper to themselves across centuries. And as you sit in the ruined library, the faint light glowing on coded words, you realize that even the most silent halls of history echo with voices waiting to be heard. You leave the quiet library behind, the whispers of monks and coded messages fading as you step into a forge still faintly warm with the memory of fire. The smell of soot clings to the air, mixed with the sharp tang of iron. Around you, blacksmiths of centuries past seem almost present in the heat, hammering metal, shaping steel with a rhythm that echoes like a heartbeat. And here finally you confront a secret that's only recently been solved, the hidden formula that made medieval steel so strong. The historical fact anchors the scene. Medieval blacksmiths, especially in Europe, created steel capable of holding an edge longer than many modern blades. Archaeologists and metallurgists have confirmed through chemical analysis that iron from certain regions contained trace amounts of carbon and other elements, carefully layered and quenched in ways that were centuries ahead of the written theory of metallurgy. Knights' swords, polearms, and armor weren't just hammered into shape, they were engineered with remarkable precision, surviving battles that would shatter lesser metals. You picture a blacksmith wiping sweat from his brow, sparks flying around him, knowing that his work would save lives or take them. And then comes the quirky detail that almost makes you grin. In some analyses, researchers found tiny bits of bone and charcoal embedded in the iron. Not an accident, not a contaminant, they were intentional, added to alter the carbon content. Imagine the blacksmith muttering, a pinch of bone for strength, a dash of charcoal for flexibility, as if seasoning a stew. Somehow the bones of animals ground into powder became part of a knight's weapon, a literal skeleton in the steel. It's macabre, yes, but ingenious. The scholarly debate still smolders. Historians and metallurgists argue whether these methods were widely understood or whether only a few master blacksmiths knew the secrets. Did most weapons truly benefit from these techniques, or were they exceptional? And did blacksmiths understand the chemistry, or was it purely trial and error honed over decades of practical observation? The evidence points to skill, but the knowledge may have been largely tacit, passed down through hands rather than books. The forge's sensory atmosphere closes around you, the tang of iron and smoke, the heat pressing against your skin, the rhythm of hammer striking steel, the faint hiss of quenched metal. You can almost feel the vibrations through your bones, the pulse of energy turning raw ore into something deadly and beautiful. And as your hand hovers above a pile of now cold iron, you realize the mystery is solved not in theory but in practice. Medieval blacksmiths weren't just laborers. They were chemists, engineers, and artists all at once, creating weapons that endured both time and legend. The forge's heat fades behind you as you step into a small clearing overgrown with grass that brushes against your knees. The sunlight here is muted, filtered through clouds that carry a faint greenish hue, almost surreal. At the center of the clearing lies a shallow grave, long disturbed by curious hands, holding remains that once inspired one of the strangest legends of the Middle Ages, the tale of the Green Children. You kneel beside the excavation, eyes widening as scientists gently brush soil away from small, oddly tinted bones. The mainstream historical fact anchors the story. Chroniclers of the 12th century in England documented the appearance of two children with green-tinged skin, speaking a language no one understood. The girl eventually integrated into society, the boy reportedly dying shortly after. For centuries, the story teetered between folklore and reality, until modern scientific analysis began testing the bones' chemical composition. Soil traces, diet remnants, and environmental factors now suggest that certain deficiencies could cause a greenish hue in children's skin, a phenomenon not common but not impossible. Here's the quirky tidbit that makes you lean in. Analysis of isotopes in the teeth indicates these children may have grown in isolated conditions, with diets lacking in iron, possibly in underground or cavernous environments. Scientists joke quietly in papers that they were literal cave children, though you can't help imagining them peering nervously from shadows, watching the strange, sunlit world above. Somehow, the legend and the science meet in a quiet, unsettling harmony. Real people, real struggles wrapped in a cloak of myth. And of course, the scholarly debate lingers. Historians still argue whether the tale was a morality lesson, a report of real events, or a mix of both. Was it a warning about isolation and superstition, a dramatized story to entertain nobles? Or do the remains prove that some children really did survive in underground or remote spaces, emerging green and bewildered into society? Evidence teases at the truth without fully revealing it. The sensory world presses around you. The wind rustles through long grass, birds call faintly in the distance, and the damp soil smells faintly of moss and minerals. Your fingertips brush the bones, fragile, almost unreal in their pale green tint. You imagine the children wandering cautiously, trying to understand the world that seems so different, hearing unfamiliar sounds, tasting unfamiliar foods, struggling with the ordinary tasks we take for granted. As you rise from the clearing, the story settles in your mind. Medieval myths are often rooted in reality, distorted through fear, wonder, and imagination. The Green Children remind you that history isn't only wars and kings, it's also strange, human, and sometimes inexplicably colorful. And in that muted green light, the mystery feels gently solved, leaving space for awe without terror. You leave the clearing of the Green Children behind, the muted sunlight fading into a cooler, shadowed corridor of a cathedral under partial ruin. The stone soars above your head in impossible arches, and your eyes follow the ribbed vaults that seem almost to float. You step carefully over rubble, the air cool and still, and you begin to understand a puzzle that has haunted architectural historians for centuries. How medieval builders managed to construct these soaring stone ceilings without modern scaffolding or technology. The historical fact is firm. Gothic cathedrals from Chartres to Canterbury employed ingenious methods of flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, and pointed arches. These techniques redistributed weight, allowing walls to be thinner and windows to be larger, and letting the structures soar higher than any previous buildings. Engineers of the time may not have had physics textbooks, but through trial, error, and careful observation, they mastered forces that would impress modern architects. You lean back to admire the vaults, imagining the workers on scaffolds hundreds of feet above the ground, hoisting stones by rope and pulley. Each stone a testament to skill and patience. Here comes the quirky detail. Hidden in the mortar of some vaults, archaeologists have discovered tiny pebbles arranged deliberately in patterns, almost like secret signatures or even jokes from the masons themselves. In one cathedral, a mason etched a tiny stick figure waving from between the stones. You can almost picture him hiding from his overseer, giving a quiet wave to future generations. It's a reminder that even in the grandeur of sacred architecture, humor and personality threaded through the stone. And yet historians still argue about the techniques themselves. Did builders rely on master plans with precise measurements, or were they guided by intuition and apprenticeship, learning from trial and error on each successive project? Some evidence suggests patterns were replicated meticulously, while other clues hint at improvisation, adjustments made mid-construction as problems arose. The truth, as always, hovers somewhere between genius and accident. The sensory imagery surrounds you. The smell of stone and damp, the faint echo of imagined hammers striking, the chill that rises from the floor even on a warm day. You run your hands lightly along the ribbed arches, feeling the cool, rough texture the way centuries of dust and soot cling to the curves. And as you look up, you can almost see the workers' shadows cast by torchlight, balancing stones like pieces in a delicate, deadly game of skill. As you step back and survey the arches, the mystery resolves into awe. The cathedral is more than stone and mortar. It is patience, intelligence, and a touch of whimsy, carved and hoisted into the sky by human hands. Each arch tells you something about medieval life, not in words, but in weight, balance, and creativity. Even centuries later, the story is visible in the shadows and lines, a solved puzzle etched into eternity. You move on from the soaring stone of cathedrals, the echo of hammers fatting behind you, and enter the small, shadowed rooms of a medieval home where the floors have long since been replaced. Beneath the floorboards, however, archaeologists have discovered tiny, mysterious jars called witch bottles, long buried and coated with centuries of dust. You crouch down, peering into one that has survived nearly intact, and suddenly the faint, sweet metallic smell of old herbs and iron rises into your nose. This is where superstition meets science in the most peculiar way. The mainstream historical fact comes first. Witch bottles were common in England from the 16th to 18th centuries. They were filled with nails, hair, urine, and other personal items, and buried under hearths, thresholds, or floors as protective charms. The idea was to trap harmful spells or ward off witches. Archaeologists have verified that many homes contain these bottles, revealing that fear and the desire to control the unseen was built into the very foundations of medieval life. You imagine a homeowner slipping the bottle into a hollow, whispering a prayer, and covering it, hoping no ill fortune ever came near. The quirky detail emerges from one particularly odd find. A bottle discovered in a Yorkshire cottage contained a mix of red wine, feathers, and what appeared to be powdered chalk, arranged in strange geometric patterns. Researchers speculate this might have been someone trying to combine traditional charms with experimental magic, a sort of early DIY protective spell. You can almost hear the homeowner muttering instructions to themselves. Yes, yes, now a feather to confuse the spirit, a sprinkle of chalk to bind it. Perfect. The combination is bizarre, practical, and faintly humorous in its earnestness. Yet historians still debate. Were these bottles primarily magical, or did they serve a psychological purpose, providing comfort to anxious households? Some argue that the bottles were indeed intended to repel evil, while others suggest they functioned more like early security measures, giving families a sense of control over unseen dangers. Whatever the answer, the evidence survives as a tangible connection to a mindset both fearful and inventive. The sensory elements draw you deeper. Your fingers brush the smooth glass, its edges pitted with time, the faint scent of rust and organic matter rising from inside. You can almost hear whispered incantations, feel the nervous tension of someone tucking the bottle beneath the floorboards, and see candlelight flickering across walls as the family prays for protection. The ritual is mundane and extraordinary at once, merging the material and the mystical. As you stand and leave the room, the mystery resolves in a subtle way. The witch bottles were part of daily life, reminders that people strived for safety in a world full of invisible threats. They represent ingenuity, superstition, and the human desire to shape fate, preserved under floors for centuries. And as you step back into the ruins, the quiet resonance of protective magic lingers, solved yet still tinged with wonder. You step softly away from the shadowed floorboards and into a stone corridor where the air carries the faint metallic tang of history. Ahead lies a tomb chamber, narrow and claustrophobic, where recent DNA testing has begun to solve one of the oldest mysteries of medieval royalty: missing royal bodies. The chamber feels alive with echoes of whispers long silenced. You crouch beside a stone sarcophagus whose lid has been pried open by archaeologists, and the story of vanished kings and princes begins to unfold beneath your fingertips. The historical fact is clear. Throughout medieval Europe, bodies of kings and nobles were often moved, hidden, or lost due to political intrigue, war, or even theft. Tombs were plundered, graves desecrated, and records forged. Modern DNA testing has allowed researchers to confirm identities in cases once thought unsolvable, revealing familial relationships, confirming royal lineages, and sometimes uncovering shocking truths about who really died where. Imagine the relief of historians as samples from century-old bones finally matched the supposed royal family tree, settling disputes that had lasted generations. Then the quirky tidbit: in one discovery, a prince's remains were found buried with a small, stuffed animal, a tiny bear, meticulously sewn from scraps of fabric. At first, it seemed like a child's toy forgotten in a tomb, but researchers speculate that it might have been a talisman, a comforting object meant to accompany him in the afterlife. You picture a young royal, perhaps no older than 10, clutching his bear in fear or affection, unaware that centuries later scientists would uncover it and marvel at the intimacy of his burial. Yet the scholarly debate persists. Historians still argue whether such burials with personal objects were common among the elite or exceptional. Did most royals receive practical, austere interments? Or were these personalized touches a norm that's rarely preserved in records? Some bones show traces of lavish clothing and delicate jewelry, while others lie bare in simple coffins, leaving questions about social practices and beliefs surrounding death. The sensory details draw you in. The cold stone walls press in, the faint smell of old lime and earth rises, the hushed scrape of archaeologists brushes echoes softly. You touch the bones gently, feel the smooth curve of a skull, the ridges of knuckles long turned to dust. It's almost eerie, intimate, and humbling at once. And as the DNA results are whispered in your mind, names restored, lives confirmed, the puzzle feels solved in both scientific and human terms. Walking away from the tomb, you sense the quiet weight of history. Vanished royals are no longer shadows. They live again in DNA sequences, in carefully reconstructed lineages, in tiny personal objects preserved alongside them. And for a moment, the ancient corridors seem to hum with the restored presence of kings and princes, their stories finally told, their mysteries gently solved. You step away from the tombs and descend into a dimly lit scriptorium, the walls lined with decayed wooden shelves, stacks of parchment leaning at precarious angles. The air smells faintly of ink and old dust, and the faint light of your lantern catches on the edges of faded musical notation, yellowed with centuries. Tonight, the mystery is melodic. Medieval music that has long been lost is now being reconstructed, note, by scholars who have cracked the cryptic, marginal notes left by scribes. The historical fact grounds you. Medieval manuscripts often contain neumes, the early form of musical notation, which did not precisely indicate rhythm or pitch in the way modern scores do. For centuries, much of this music was unplayable because the system was incomplete. Recent scholarship has used these marginal annotations, alongside other manuscripts, to recreate melodies, revealing music that once echoed through cathedrals, courts, and convents. You can almost hear it in your mind, airy chants, slow and haunting, blending with the echo of stone walls and flickering candlelight. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some scribes drew little faces, animals, and stick figures alongside their notes, often in the spaces where a musician might glance while reading. One particularly humorous example shows a tiny monk leaping off a staff line, arms flailing as if dancing to the music himself. You can picture a scribe chuckling softly as he drew, adding levity to a sacred task, and it makes the music feel alive, infused with personality. Yet historians still argue about interpretation. How much of the reconstructed music reflects the actual medieval sound, and how much is speculation? Some melodies are highly conjectural, and performance choices, tempo, ornamentation, dynamics remain open to debate. Were these tunes simple devotional chants or complex performances meant for entertainment in courts? The evidence provides fragments, but the full soundscape is reconstructed from imagination guided by historical clues. The sensory details pull you in further. The scratch of quill on parchment, the faint smell of aged ink mixed with beeswax from candlelight, the hushed murmur of imagined voices joining in the melodies. You can almost see a small choir of nuns or novice monks, voices trembling with effort, guided by these notations, unaware that centuries later, their sounds would be pieced together note by note. As you step back into the scriptorium's shadows, the mystery resolves. The music is more than abstract lines on parchment. It's playful, intimate, and human. The scribe's doodles, the reconstructed melodies, the echoes of devotion and joy all converge to remind you that medieval life wasn't only struggle, it was also music, laughter, and subtle creativity, preserved faintly across the centuries. You leave the scriptorium behind, the faint echo of reconstructed chants fading into a hushed silence, and you enter a narrow, overgrown courtyard where fragments of pottery and broken tools poke from the soil. This is where the mystery of medieval diet and daily life has been quietly solved in recent decades, not through chronicles or paintings, but through the chemical traces left in what people ate and how they disposed of it. You kneel and let your fingers brush the edges of shards, the textures telling stories no ink could capture. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Medieval diets varied widely depending on class, region, and season. Peasants relied heavily on grains, legumes, and occasionally salted or smoked meat, while nobility enjoyed a more varied fare, including imported spices, sugar, and game. Archaeologists can now analyze residue inside pots to confirm the contents of meals. Traces of grains, meat, fish, and even herbs are preserved in ways that centuries of storytelling could not fully explain. You imagine a steaming pot of pottage, thick and gray, the scent of herbs blending with the earthy smell of the hearth, simmering over a low flame as a family gathers quietly to eat. The quirky detail emerges from one particular find. Residues from a noble's banquet included traces of crocodile dung, likely used as a preservative for fish or in some exotic recipes meant to impress guests. You almost chuckle at the image, a medieval chef carefully wrapping fish thinking, yes, this will keep nicely and also smell faintly of swamp. It's disgusting, ingenious, and oddly charming in its resourcefulness. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or isolated to experimental kitchens trying to impress elite patrons. The debate continues further. Some scholars suggest that these strange additives were common, reflecting both a lack of refrigeration and a taste for the unusual. Others argue that the rare and exotic substances were largely ceremonial, used to demonstrate wealth and status rather than for necessity. Either way, the chemical evidence preserves a story lost to written records. Sensory details deepen as you crouch beside a shard smeared with dark residue. The earthy tang of old food, the grit of centuries in your fingertips, the imagined sizzle and clatter of a medieval kitchen. You picture cooks moving between hearths, stirring pottages, seasoning meat with whatever they could find, sneaking tastes when no one is watching. The aroma is faint but evocative, a ghostly reminder of life in a long-vanished era. As you step away from the courtyard, the mystery feels solved yet vivid. Medieval life was a blend of survival, ingenuity, and culinary curiosity. Every shard, every residue, every faint aroma holds a story of ordinary humans navigating a complex world. And in that quiet space, the centuries seem to fold over themselves, leaving you with a tangible connection to lives once lived, struggles once faced, and meals once shared. You move on from the courtyard, the earthy scent of ancient kitchens fading, and enter a narrow, fog-drenched alley in a medieval town, cobblestones slick beneath your feet. Here, the mystery unfolds not in grand cathedrals or tombs, but in the grime and graffiti of everyday life, early urban planning, sewage systems, and evidence of how ordinary people navigated crowded, often chaotic streets. Archaeologists have recently solved a puzzle that had long intrigued historians: how medieval towns managed or failed to manage waste and drainage in ways that affected health, commerce, and daily life. The historical fact is straightforward. Many medieval towns were notoriously unsanitary. Streets doubled as sewers, with waste dumped into ditches or directly onto cobbles. Homes had privies that emptied into open gutters. Waterborne disease spread easily, and outbreaks were frequent. Yet recent studies of urban layers, soil, and sediment have revealed surprisingly sophisticated solutions in some towns, including rudimentary drainage channels, soak pits, and strategically placed latrines. These solutions reveal a pragmatic response to a pressing problem long before modern sanitation engineering. You imagine townspeople balancing carts, dodging waste, and navigating these alleys with care, aware of the hazards around every corner. The quirky detail makes you stifle a laugh. In one excavation of York, researchers found discarded shoes, animal bones, and even a clay figurine wedged into a drainage channel, apparently meant to ward off evil spirits believed to linger in the muck. Someone literally tried to perform magic in the middle of a sewer. You picture a harried merchant dropping a tiny clay man into a canal while muttering a charm, hoping it would protect his stall from disease or theft. It's absurd but strangely charming. The scholarly debate lingers. Historians still argue whether such magical practices were widely believed or largely symbolic. Did townspeople genuinely expect charms to purify their streets, or were these small acts of superstition meant to provide psychological comfort amid daily hazards? Some evidence suggests ritualistic intent, while other examples appear more playful, hinting at humor alongside belief. The truth probably lies somewhere in the murky middle. The sensory elements pull you into the scene. The tang of wet earth mixed with animal waste, the damp chill in your bones, the faint echo of footsteps on uneven cobbles. You can almost hear merchants shouting over the din, children dodging puddles, and dogs barking as they sniff through refuse. The atmosphere is chaotic, pungent, and alive, a reminder that history isn't always grand, it's messy, human, and persistent. As you step out of the alley, the mystery resolves in a practical, if surprising, way. Medieval towns were both dangerous and ingenious. Layers of refuse, drainage, and superstition coexisted to create a livable space for ordinary people, revealing creativity born from necessity. And as the fog lifts, you sense the persistence of human ingenuity even in the grime, a lesson quietly preserved in soil and stone. You leave the narrow alley behind and find yourself at the edge of a windswept field, dotted with stones that mark long-forgotten graves. Here lies another solved mystery, quieter than battles or plagues, but just as profound: medieval childbirth and the maternal experience, often hidden from records but preserved in skeletal remains, burial arrangements, and carefully noted artifacts. Archaeologists and historians have pieced together evidence that reveals the challenges, rituals, and realities of pregnancy and birth in the Middle Ages. The historical fact stands firm: maternal and infant mortality rates were high. Women gave birth at home, often attended by midwives who carried knowledge passed orally through generations. Tools like birthing stools, herbal remedies, and charms were commonly used, and families relied on a mixture of practical skill and superstition to navigate the process. Recent studies of skeletal remains indicate repeated pregnancies, complications visible in pelvic bones, and signs of stress, offering tangible insight into the hardships endured by medieval women. You imagine a dimly lit room, a midwife guiding a laboring mother, the smell of herbs filling the air as chants and prayers mingle with the sounds of effort. The quirky discovery comes from a burial site in rural England. One grave contained a small clay doll placed between the mother and child. Researchers believe this might have been a protective talisman, meant to ensure safe delivery or guard against misfortune. The figure's stubby arms and cheerful expression suggest hope and tenderness, a tiny gesture meant to comfort both mother and spirit. You can almost picture a midwife quietly handing it to the mother, whispering reassurance, a small charm to help her through a moment of fear and hope. The scholarly debate continues. Historians still argue how widespread such talismans were and whether they were rooted in pagan traditions, Christian ritual, or simply pragmatic comfort measures. Were charms a universal part of childbirth or reserved for those who could afford extra protection? The evidence points to a mix: practical herbal remedies interwoven with symbolic objects, but never a uniform practice. The sensory imagery surrounds you: the cool, earthy floor beneath your knees, the faint aroma of dried herbs, the muted sound of a baby's cry echoing across centuries, imagined but vivid. You can almost feel the tension, relief, and hope that accompanied each birth, the repetition of life amid a world often harsh and unforgiving. As you stand among the gravestones, the mystery resolves into something both intimate and universal. Medieval childbirth was fraught, deeply human, and sometimes marked by small, personal gestures of hope. In bones, artifacts, and quiet graves, centuries of maternal experience whisper their truths, finally audible to those willing to listen. You step away from the gravestones and wander toward the edge of a dense forest, the sunlight filtering through leaves in patchy gold. Here lies a different kind of medieval mystery, one tied to the very land itself: forest law, resource management, and the secret life of woodland commons. For centuries, historians puzzled over how medieval communities regulated hunting, grazing, and timber without modern government oversight. Recent archaeological and documentary work has begun to reveal a surprisingly sophisticated system, solving questions that lingered for centuries. The historical fact is solid. Forests were legally protected in many regions, particularly those designated as royal or noble hunting preserves. Commoners could not simply take timber, hunt game, or graze animals without permission, yet these laws were enforced in complex ways, involving wardens, fines, and sometimes corporal punishment. Surveys and boundary markers, long buried in undergrowth, are now being mapped, showing that medieval communities maintained careful records and clear demarcations. You imagine villagers tiptoeing along hidden paths, baskets of firewood on their backs, hoping the warden's patrol doesn't catch them. The quirky tidbit emerges from one recent excavation. Tiny clay figurines, sometimes animals, sometimes human figures, were buried at forest edges, possibly as protective charms or territorial markers. One site in northern France contained dozens of miniature deer figurines, perhaps a playful nod to the very animals the forest laws sought to protect, or maybe an early "beware of hunters" warning. You can almost picture a forester chuckling as he buried these tiny guardians, a secret game of charm and superstition hidden from the prying eyes of nobles. And yet scholarly debate persists. Historians still argue whether these figurines were primarily symbolic, meant to ensure hunting success or protection, or whether they were personal talismans left by superstitious villagers. Were they widespread across Europe or localized phenomena tied to particular forest traditions? Archaeologists continue to interpret their placement, orientation, and frequency, and while trends are emerging, the full meaning remains partly obscured by time. The sensory imagery envelops you. The smell of damp leaves and rich soil, the faint rustle of small animals moving unseen, the shadowed coolness beneath thick canopy. You hear the imagined creak of boughs and the snap of twigs under cautious feet, feel moss under fingertips, and almost sense the heartbeat of the forest as it existed centuries ago. As you step back from the dense woodland, the mystery resolves in an elegant way. Medieval forests were not lawless wilds but managed ecosystems, governed by rules, rituals, and subtle magic. Trees, animals, and humans all coexisted within a framework that was part regulation, part superstition, and wholly human. The forest hums quietly with centuries of preserved order.